Recording and all yours, Mary.
Okay, I'll call it order the November, I almost said February for some reason, November 6th meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. For this meeting, the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is convening by video conference via the Zoom app as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. We have new public participation guidelines. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full name for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member of the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or who acts inappropriately. We need to confirm member access. I am Mary Longacre, Chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. I'll confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Going in alphabetical order, Sarah Boyce, please respond.
Yep, I'm here and I hear you.
Peter Brace.
Here.
Graham Durovich.
Here.
Matt Fee.
Here.
That is everybody we have right now. So we do have a quorum of 5. For staff, Vince Murphy.
Here.
Holly Backus.
Present.
And guest, we have Kimberly Rose from Acclimate.
Hello.
I think that's everybody, right, Vince? Okay. We have an anticipated speaker. That is Dr. Chip Fletcher from the University of Hawaii. Chip, just say hello to us, please.
Hello, everybody.
Great, thank you. And I'll continue with the opening announcements. This open meeting of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee is being conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12th, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. In order to mitigate the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, we have been advised and directed by the Commonwealth to suspend public gatherings, and as such, the Governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings in a publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted with the agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded so that the public can follow along with the deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. Time permitting, this meeting will feature public comment. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you and take care not to share the screen on your computer. Anything you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials that have been provided members of this body are available on the town's website unless otherwise noted. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless the chair notes otherwise. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, I'll cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct. The chair will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, the chair will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you are not speaking, and please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you and state your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in a conversation with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. For items with public comment, after members have spoken, the chair will afford public comment to those members of the public that have joined the meeting via Zoom. Members of the public who wish to speak must state their names and be acknowledged by and speak through the chair. Finally, any vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call. All right. We have just one item on the agenda. A reminder again, this meeting is being audio and visually recorded. And our meeting today is a discussion with Dr. Chip Fletcher of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And he is also the vice chair for the Honolulu Climate Change Commission. I'm going to read a brief introduction and then we'll welcome him to the meeting. In 2011, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recognized Dr. Fletcher's professional work with an Environmental Achievement Award in Climate Change Science. And in 2018, he was given the Leadership Award by the Pacific Risk Management Ohana, or PRIMO, a coalition of organizations with a role in hazard risk management in the Pacific region. His research focuses on Pacific paleo sea level history, beach processes, and modeling the impacts of past, present, and future sea level rise on island environments and communities. The results of his work are used by government agencies for administering coastal policy, establishing construction guidelines, and planning resilient infrastructure projects. With his students, Dr. Fletcher has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles as well as 3 textbooks. Dr. Fletcher was recommended to us by R.P. Eddy, and after I heard him interviewed on the American Shoreline podcast on the topic of evolving coastal management, we invited him to join us today to speak about potential erosion and coastal resilience policies. Dr. Fletcher, not only are we also an island, but I read recently that, like Nantucket, Hawaii occasionally talks about secession. So we have that in common as well. And welcome,
Yeah,
Dr. Fletcher.
we're serious about it. Thanks very much, Mary, and thanks everybody. It's morning here in Hawaii. It's a little after 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you. I have some PowerPoint slides to sort of get our intellectual juices flowing. So if that's okay, how about if I jump straight into that? So I'll share.
Please go ahead. Yeah. Vince, is Dr. Fletcher enabled for screen sharing? Yes, he is.
Look like we got here. So waiting for my PowerPoint to go into display mode. And there we go. All right, can you guys see this first slide?
Yes, that's a little scary.
Yeah, so that's Miami, I think, actually. But it's amazing I like to tell my students, this is a photograph of Miami. And it really takes a long time to register that it's really not a photograph. It's an artistic depiction of Miami some point in the future under, I would guess, 2 meters of sea level rise. But let's move beyond that. And what I think is very important to do is to watch the signals coming out of the energy sector in terms of continued emissions and outlooks or projections for future emissions. So I'm going to go through what the messaging is there. And I know you guys are very well informed along these lines, so I'm not going to dwell on any of this. So global emissions are basically at 40 billion tons of CO2 per year. CO2 is the gas that we track because once it's emitted, it can stay in the atmosphere for over 1,000 years, slowly declining, of course, at lower and lower concentrations. But most of the other emissions of large concentrations have much shorter lifetimes. China is currently the world's largest emitter at over 25% of annual emissions, but taken cumulatively, the US is responsible for about 1/4 of the emissions that have now caused about 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming since the pre-industrial time, and all sorts of effects and ramifications in terms of extreme weather, melting of the ice centers around the planet. We're starting to see the boreal forest and the Amazon rainforest switch from being carbon sinks or storage sites to carbon sources, and a whole number of other sort of bio-geo global systems are behaving in a way indicating that they are definitely feeling the heat, even though it's only a little more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer The poorest countries emit less than 1% each of greenhouse gas emissions, but suffer the most. And under current policies of energy use and land use, warming is expected to be someplace beyond 3 degrees Celsius. And the World Meteorological Organization, immediately prior to COVID, announced that there's a 1 in 5 chance that we will hit 1.5 degrees C as a mean global annual temperature sometime in the next 5 years. Energy consumption, of course, is responsible for the majority of these heat trapping emissions. And this is the history since the late 19th century. Coal is shown in black, oil, gas in terms of natural gas. Altogether, these constitute about 85% of the fuels leading to energy consumption at the end of 2019. Nuclear accounts for about 4.5%, hydroelectric and wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass, sort of collectively the renewable energies at about 11%. But the truth is that in 2019, as in previous years, fossil fuel use is outpacing renewable energy use. And mostly what's going on here is that the demand for new forms of energy is leading to the use of infrastructure that is already in place. And of course, that's fossil fuel infrastructure. The demands for new energy are coming out of the developing world. And consequently, renewable energy, even though it's being deployed at amazing rates, it's not replacing fossil fuels. It is simply helping fossil fuels meet the demand for new energy. This is exactly what oil did in the late 19th century or the mid 19th century. It didn't replace coal. It simply helped coal meet the demand for new energy with growing GDP. And as you know, the reigning model, the economic model worldwide is growth. And as that happens, you need tremendous amounts of energy, and every year more of it. So again, at the end of 2019, the beginning of this year, the projections from a whole range of energy economists shown on the left here, the International Energy Agency, British Petroleum, the US Energy Information Administration, Equinor, Exxon, Shell, Sky, and then various scenarios of some of these organizations. They all project continued emissions to 2040 and to 2050. But if we want to meet the Paris targets, the CO2 pathway needs to follow the green arrow, and the black dashed line is the pathway to stopping warming at 1.5 C, and the purple dashes to 2 degrees Celsius. And I had never heard of this congressional think tank. It's called the Resources for the Future Institute. It's funded by Congress, and apparently it was stood up in the 1950s. It's nonpartisan. It is still hard at work, and they issued a global energy outlook last year. And they said that under most scenarios, carbon dioxide emissions from the global energy system are on a path to far exceed international targets of the Paris Agreement. All right, so that was the situation just before the pandemic. We've now been in this pandemic for, I don't know how many months is it? 10, 9? And the first energy outlook that has emerged that takes the pandemic into account just came out last week, and it's by Bloomberg NEF. And they state that global CO2 emissions from energy may have peaked last year. 2019 may be peak CO2 emissions. Because of COVID, they're anticipating emissions to drop 8% this year in 2020. And then in parallel with recovery, economic recovery from the recession that the pandemic has caused, emissions will rise again. They expect to that global economy will pull out of the pandemic by 2027, and emissions will slowly rise along with that recovery. At which point they're projecting slowly declining emissions of about 0.7% per year towards mid-century. So this puts us on a global pathway to 3.3 degrees C. And if you had tracked any of the United Nations Environmental Program reports that came out annually since the Paris 2015 agreement, these reports were called the GAP report, and it was a report on the gap between the emissions that we need to adhere to meet the 1.5 and 2 degree targets versus the actual emissions and the stated national policies around the world. And that GAP report also identified 3.2, not 3.3, but 3.2 degrees. So there is agreement there. To keep warming well below 2 degrees C, which was the United Nations goal, emissions have to fall 10 times faster than their projection of 0.7%. They need to fall at about 6% per year to mid-century. And to keep warming from rising above 1.5, emissions have to fall at 10% per year rather than 0.7. So these are the new pathways given the influence of the pandemic. Overall, the pandemic decline in emissions for 2020 subtracts about 2.5 years in aggregate from the next 30 years of emissions. So that's the impact. It's a blip. In fact, we had a similar blip in 2008, 2009 with that recession. All right, so here is the history of CO2 emissions. And here is what needs to happen. We need to be at 0 emissions by mid-century, or we can have another 15 years and reach 0 emissions by 2065 if we want to hit the United Nations targets. What a lot of people forget is that even after we hit these emissions targets, if we do, and I'm skeptical, we have to remove CO2 from the air for centuries. Less than that if we remove it more effectively. And we can do that through changing our agriculture practices, through preserving natural areas and enhancing natural areas, or we can go the mechanical route with direct air capture of CO2 and sequestration into the ground. Plus, you can make various things out of the CO2 that you capture. For instance, you can make jet fuel. And we're talking about putting a CO2 direct air capture plant at Honolulu Airport, making jet fuel that is then burnt, released into the atmosphere, and then we pull it back out again. And so we would be recycling this carbon. It doesn't lead to a decrease, but it prevents the increase associated with fossil fuels and aviation. So overall, the projections from the energy sector, and I have to tell you the land use sector, and those are the two major sources of CO2 emissions, a third being the response of the natural world to the warming to date, releasing carbon rather than storing it in various locations. We're on a pathway to someplace above 3 degrees Celsius. And there are lots and lots of other indicators to this and scientific studies that back this up. So how bad is 3 degrees Celsius? A paper came out in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences called the Human Climate Niche, N-I-C-H-E. And it said that at temperatures 3 degrees Celsius or above, 20% of the global land surface assumes the climate that today is only found in the deepest parts of the Sahara Desert. This would result in food and water shortages and lead to perhaps as much as 1/3 of humanity, which by mid-century or after, we're going to have a global population of 9.5 to 10 billion. So potentially 3 billion people in this area that is 20% of the land surface, now too hot for really human activities, needing to move to new locations. And this really sets up a crisis. Where will these people go? How will they be received? And how will they be assimilated, if at all? And if you're not on Jim Hanson's regular email list, you should get on it. He is a former NASA scientist in New York City. He's at Columbia University now. And he sent this out either last week or the week before. It shows a long-term trend of global warming going back to 1970. And then now in the past 5 years, a departure from that trend that cannot be accounted for by natural climate variability. So global warming seems to be lifting off of a long-term trend. In other words, it's accelerating. All right, so that was to set context and stage. And now the real reason why we're here is to talk about sea level rise. As you know, there are various satellite missions that both monitor the sea surface using satellite altimetry and give us an amazing database on the rise in sea level. There's also another satellite mission that is tracking the loss of ice, and we'll look at that in just a second. So the satellite altimetry data tells us that the global rate of sea level rise is about 1 foot per century, or 3.4 millimeters per year. A paper came out by Steve Neeram at University of Colorado, who has been involved with satellite altimetry since its beginning. And this was in 2018 in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. He found an acceleration in the rate of global sea level rise, this database in front of you. And that acceleration rate takes us to about 65 centimeters, which is a little over 2 feet of sea level rise, global sea level rise by the end of the century. Now, the current rate of sea level rise is a reflection of emissions that are at least 10 years old. There's a temporal lag or a time lag from the minute you say, turn on your internal combustion engine automobile. The CO2 that comes out of your tailpipe, on average, doesn't begin trapping heat for a decade. It may take as long as several decades, or it could be as short as a few years. But on average, there is this delay. So warming today is from greenhouse gas emissions in the recent past. Melting of ice is also not an instantaneous phenomenon. If I take an ice cube and put it on the table right here, it doesn't melt like that. It takes some time. And if I take the Greenland ice sheet and put it on the table here, the amount of time it will need to warm, in other words, to come into equilibrium with the temperature, will be many, many centuries. In fact, at today's temperature, it'll be a couple of thousand years. So the warming today is not a reflection of today, the melting of today is not a reflection of today's warming. It's a reflection of past warming. And also, as we replace fossil fuels and their dirty emissions, which send particulate matter, especially sulfates, up into the stratosphere, which is the next layer of atmosphere above us, they reflect sunlight. Some of those particulates, the dark carbon particulates, actually absorb sunlight and then act as a greenhouse effect and re-radiate heat. But we also have these little reflecting particles that actually lead to a little bit of cooling, counteracting global warming. But as we replace, and this is called global dimming, as we replace dirty fossil fuel emissions with clean renewable energy, global dimming will lessen. And that's another enhancement on warming. So altogether, this bundle of processes plus a few others is called committed warming. And today, committed warming is estimated to be about 0.8 degrees Celsius. So we could stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, and committed warming tells us we will see an average of 0.8 degrees Celsius additional warming, which also means the first UN target of 1.5 degrees C is lost. And when you add that to all of these economic projections of continued emissions, it becomes really, in my mind, a very clear set of signals that we need to prepare for some of the worst consequences of climate change, and sea level rise, of course, being among them. In the last 10 years, the rate of sea level rise is another millimeter higher. It's 4.6 millimeters per year. In other words, we're currently on track for sea level rise of about 1.5 feet per century. But the rate of acceleration, as pointed out by Neeram, takes us up to just over 2 feet by the end of the century. But that represents the influence of past human activities. So it's extremely likely that we're going to see sea level rise much more than just 2 feet by the end of the century. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on the ocean and cryosphere and a changing climate, which came out last year, gave us this analysis of the components that go into global sea level rise. Thermal expansion of the ocean, about 1.4 millimeters per year. Mountain glaciers of the world, about 0.6 millimeters per year. The Greenland ice sheet, 0.7. Antarctica, 0.4. And then the human activity of building dams and reservoirs, preventing water that would otherwise run into the ocean, especially water that we pull out of the ground and then release. The net effect of all that, damming water and then pulling groundwater up and releasing it, that's a negative component to the budget of about 0.2 millimeters per year. And altogether, these add up to about 3 millimeters per year. And the observed rise, as you've seen, around 3.5, and we saw 3.4 up to 4.6. So the feeling is that we understand the components going into sea level rise reasonably well within the statistical error. And that same report projects that sea level rise under a low emissions scenario by the end of the century would be on the order of 0.5 meter, so 1.5 feet or so, and under high emissions on the order of 1 meter, 3.3 feet, anywhere from 0.6 to 1.1 meters. And this is the largest projection, this 1.1 meters, the largest projection the IPCC has come out with since their origin. And it's because they take into account the very rapid melting going on with certain glaciers in West Antarctica that we're going to look at in a minute. But sea level rise does not stop at the end of this century, and the report projects under low emissions anywhere from 0.6 to 1 meter by the second century out, by the 2300s, and under high emissions, multi-meter sea level rise of between 2 and 5.5 meters. I'll let you in now on what I'm thinking, that I am fearful of multi-meter sea level rise this century. So this is another satellite mission. It's called GRACE, Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. It actually has 2 components. And this is the GRACE follow-on mission. The first mission ended after, I think it was about 10 years, and follow-on is now up and adding to our database. That mission tracks changing gravity over highly precise areas of Earth's surface. So every time it passes over the Greenland ice sheet, as the melting takes place, there's a loss in mass, and that causes a decrease in gravity that is observed by the satellite, and it's converted into billions of tons. Altogether, the GRACE mission and follow-on mission have found that melting on Greenland and Antarctica together is occurring 6 times faster than in the 1990s. And that it is tracking the worst case emissions scenario of IPCC. And they conclude that sea level rise could leave 400 million people exposed to coastal flooding each year by the end of the century. This is the Greenland data from the GRACE mission. You can see the little break in the data down here. That's the transition from the original GRACE mission to now the follow-on mission. Greenland's losing an average of 280 billion tons of ice per year, or mass per year. And if you look at the image of Greenland, you can see that there is still net accumulation on the high plateau, the light shades of blue, and here's your scale. But from the coastal area and creeping up in elevation towards the high plateau, we have net melting going on. A set of cores of the ice from around the Greenland ice sheet, which were analyzed in terms of melt runoff, which was frozen into the cores and gives a different signature in the ice, going back several centuries to the 16th century. There is this very rapid increase in runoff of 250 to 575% over the last 20 years. So freshwater runoff off the surface of the Greenland ice sheet now experiencing a 2 to 5-fold increase in the last 2 decades. Antarctica.
Chip, I hate to interrupt, but I think we'd really like to talk more about what can we do to, as you said, to prepare for these threats.
Well, I was gonna finish up with this, and I was going to show you what Hawaii is doing, but I can close it down. If this is stuff you all know, I'd be happy to close this down, and we can just have a discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate some of the new information that you're bringing, but I think we would like to move to the discussion if you don't mind.
Fine.
Um,
So I stopped
Madam
sharing.
Chairwoman, can I ask a
Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
I don't want you to skip over what Hawaii is doing though. I think that
Oh,
would be hugely beneficial. So if you did have slides on that, I would really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
All right, so I just ended my slideshow and I've stopped sharing the screen. Let me get allow my computer to come back into equilibrium here.
So I know it's disruptive to pause in the middle of something, but we did get a little bit of a late start and we're coming up on 1:45. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions and information.
I understood us to have 2
yeah.
hours total. Is that not
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
Okay. Let's see. Well, why don't I just, why don't we just go to some of the links I've given you. And I guess I'll go back into screen share. All right, so this is a link. The second link, State of Hawaii Climate Change. So ikumo mai means welcome. This is the Hawaii Climate Change Portal, which is part of the State Commission on Climate Change. And if you scroll down on that link, you'll see the Hawaii Sea Level Rise report down here. We click on that. This report looks at annual high wave flooding, coastal erosion, and then bathtub modeling, still water modeling on a digital elevation model. It does this for, and if we go to the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is the first link I gave you, the modeling is based on Assessment Report 5 from the IPCC, which came out in 2013. That reflects science from about 2012 and earlier. And our modeling is along the upper edge of the sort of cone of uncertainty to the worst case scenario, RCP 8.5, of their sea level projection. Now their sea level projections at the worst case is a little less than 1 meter by the end of the century. It's 98 centimeters, which is 3.2 feet. At 2070, we use 2 feet of sea level rise. At 2050, 1.1, and at 2030, half a foot of sea level rise. So those are the modeling scenarios that my research team did for that report. And they are depicted here on the Hawaii Sea Level Rise viewer. On this viewer, if you go to view full screen map, and let's zoom to our capital island, which is Oahu. And let's zoom to Waikiki, which is currently a ghost town, but was previously the gateway to over 10 million visitors per year. And we can put up a base map, which is a satellite image. And we can look at, this is similar to the NOAA sea level rise viewer, but sorry about that, I went the wrong way. It allows us to zoom in much tighter than the NOAA viewer. And I think I understood that you have NOAA layers that allow you to zoom in much tighter than their standard online tool allows. So Waikiki is this little district right here. And at 1/2 foot of sea level rise, we see the current ocean water plus a little bit of flooding. At 1.1 feet, we start to see some of these blue areas. At 2 feet, there's an expansion, and between 2 and 3.2 feet, there is a dramatic increase. And you can see flooding up here that is not connected to the ocean. If you look at the annual flooding by waves, we get this story. And if you look at coastal erosion, we get this red line, which is the 80% probability of coastal erosion. Now, if we combine all of these in what's known as a sea level rise exposure area, or SLEREXA, we now have a model product which is being pushed by the state as a new planning district. So everything in blue is a hazard district, which is available off of this website as a GIS layer. And in fact, each of these hazards at each of these sea level rise scenarios is available to be pulled off as a GIS layer. And what the state is encouraging is that at the county level, that these data be used for developing new policies. And the mayor of Maui, we do not have cities in Hawaii. The lowest government layer is counties, and the counties are governed by a mayor, the executive branch, and a council, which is basically the county version of Congress. The mayors of Maui and Oahu have both made declarations that all of their departments must use this data for their CIP decisions, for developing new policies, for developing new permit criteria, etc. So Hawaii is swinging towards model products to develop policies.
We're
And-
trying to take that first step here as well. We've just passed a policy saying, use the NOAA high scenario in project planning as a consideration for your engineering.
Right. So the problem with 3.2 feet is that if you look at so that's a global mean. If you look at their local relative sea level rise, and I know that you guys have a spreadsheet from NOAA, which gives you the scenarios for your tide gauge. You get, at least in Hawaii, you get a higher sea level than 3.2 feet. And 3.2 feet actually arrives sometime in the decade of the 2080s. So my research team is hard at work pulling together the funding and working on modeling to depict these hazards under 1 foot scenarios, keeping with the NOAA online tool, and also using local relative sea level timetables. NOAA gives you a decade by decade timetable, and using that for sort of sea level rise 2.0. Now it's going to take us a couple of years to get there, but that's where we're headed. And all of the staff, all of the agency staff and heads of departments have been told repeatedly, science does not stop. Please expect additional products. And so while we expect lots of grunts and groans, they know to prepare for revisiting all the policies, et cetera. And just
That's an excellent point.
one last thing is that Maui County, which I'm not showing here, this is Oahu, Maui County is using our erosion product as their new setback. And because it's an erosion product, there are locations on the shoreline which are geologically not erodible. The setback then defaults to a flat 200 feet. Because we live on volcanoes, we're assuming that volcanic rock is not erodible. So then the setback becomes 200 feet. Otherwise, it is this 80% projection of erosion.
Chip, would you tell us a little bit more about how you determine those setbacks? I know that you were talking before that there's a formula in many cases, and if you would tell the committee members more about that, I think that would be great.
Sure. So we have a thing called the administrative shoreline, and it's defined as the upper reach of the wash of the waves at high tide during the time of the year when the waves are highest. And that marks a line. This is our North Shore. That marks a line parcel by parcel from which the setback is measured. Now we have a very seasonal wave environment here. Depending on which side of the island you're on, South Shore or North Shore, we get much larger waves in winter or summer than in the other seasons. Up here on the North Shore, we get huge waves in the wintertime. And so the definition of the shoreline means that you need, the shoreline is set by the highest waves of the year at high tide. Now, when was that? It might have been at 3 a.m. No one was there to drive a stake in the ground. So we have professional surveyors who have gone through training to recognize, they've basically gone through coastal geology training. They've learned to recognize salt evaporation deposits. They've learned to recognize debris carried by the waves. They've learned to recognize plant species that are salt tolerant versus those that are not. And they are hired by the landowner, which is a conflict of interest, when the landowner wants to either build on their parcel or renovate or convert their parcel. The surveyor will look for evidence of the highest reach of the waves. He will mark a line. He will make a map, send it in for approval at the state level. The state then comes out to the parcel and double checks the location of the where the line has been set. And that line then is from which the setback is measured. And the statewide setback was just changed to 40 feet from this line. But each county has the capacity to set their own setback as long as it's not regressive against the 40 feet, previously 20 feet. And the county of Maui is now using our model product under 3.2 feet of sea level rise, which in many cases goes to the second or third home back from the shoreline, meaning that these front homes are non-conforming and they have a whole set of rules as to what the homeowner now that is non-conforming to the setback may or may not do. For instance, if their house burns down, they are allowed to rebuild, but there is a minimum buildable footprint that is defined. And the minimum buildable footprint I'm going to say it's 1,500 square feet. You should double check that. But if you put a second story on it, you've got a 3,000 square foot house. This prevents the takings, a takings lawsuit. If you want to renovate, I think it's more than 50% of your house, and how they calculate 50%. It's not just simple surface area. An inspector comes out, and the percentage of your total structure that is going to be renovated is determined by a formula involving internal square footage, as well as footprint square footage, as well as value. If it's more than 50%, your renovation has to fall now within the 1,500 square foot minimum buildable footprint. So these rules lead to shrinking the house and pushing it as far back as possible. On Kauai, they have a rate-based setback. We have a data set from every parcel on Kauai, Maui, and Oahu, which identifies the shoreline. And in this case, the shoreline that we have identified as the toe of the beach, which if you look in this photograph, it's where the wave pulls all the way back on its return flow down the beach. That's the toe of the beach. If you ever go to a beach, you'll notice there's a little tiny step, not all the time, but sometimes. That's the base of the foreshore. We can map that in the clear waters of Hawaii, provided there's not high wave energy in the air photo. We have air photos going back to 1920, and we've mapped this location of the toe of the beach, and every 20 meters or 66 feet along the shoreline, we have a rate of shoreline change. In many cases, it's erosional, and that annual rate of erosion is used to calculate the setback. It's 75 times the annual rate of erosion. 75 is the national, or maybe it's 70, the national average lifetime of a wood frame house.
Although I will note that we have wood framed houses built in the 1600s and 1700s that are very precious here. So I understand that's a national average.
No, but what it doesn't take into account is nobody walks away from their house after 70 years. Every house in the world gets either torn down or rebuilt in the footprint or renovated. So it's just a number, and planning, as you know, you need the best available information. So that's what's used. But they also, so in addition, so their setback on Kauai is 70 times the annual rate of erosion plus 40 feet. And 40 feet is taken as to accommodate uncertainty in our modeling of the annual rate of erosion. Then they have a second table which looks at the depth of the lot. If it's 100 feet deep, if it's 150 or 200 feet deep, there's a percentage now that you calculate of the depth. And you have the rate-based setback or the percentage of your lot depth setback, and whichever is greater then is your setback. So that's for Kauai and Maui. Yeah, Sarah.
Sarah, go ahead,
I just
please.
had a question, and this is more at the municipality level of who made these decisions about the setbacks and which science they use and which measuring, and was it like a ballot measure? How did you gain support from the community? Because I imagine the homeowners weren't psyched about that. So I'm just curious about some of that process throughout the different counties.
So I had to grow up fast because in 2000, Maui was the first county to depart from a flat 40 feet. And they decided, because they had a new planning director under a new mayor, they decided to utilize our erosion data. And so they came up with 50 times the annual rate of erosion. And the process is that they propose a new setback to their planning commission. And then they take it on the road. And They give a series of public workshops all around the island. In 2000 to 2002, I forget exactly, the public workshops were just about completed, and I think they did 8 workshops over the course of 6 months. And that's currently what they're doing with the new setback. And at the last workshop, there was a complaint that got filed with the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission decided to send a postcard out to every parcel owner on the island, alerting them to this change in setback. At that point, we have several wealthy homeowners on Maui, second and third homes, and it's a situation I know you're familiar with. The teams of lawyers came out, and they started organizing architects, carpenters, electricians, realtors, and they began a 2-year campaign to fight the setback. They harassed the president of the University of Hawaii about the shoddy science that I had been engaged in, that the fingerprints of my bias were all over the data, on and on. I was subpoenaed several times. We had to put all of our data, all of our scans of air photos and our vectors on the air photos of where the toe of the beach was and how we calculated the rates. We did a linear regression on figuring out the rate of change, and they brought in, folks who could say, well, why did you use a linear regression, and what's your method for identifying the points that don't fall on the line, the uncertainty, blah, 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 blah. It went on and on. It was quite an experience. We had drive-bys by my house. Anyway, I don't want to turn this into a Chip Fletcher therapy session, but it was amazing. And all the while, what I was experiencing, what the planning department was experiencing, and the planners themselves, we made sure to make it public. We spoke loud and clear about what we were experiencing as these episodes would occur. The Planning Commission saw what was going on, and they held a final vote. I think it was 2003 or 2004, and the room was crammed with people. They moved to council chambers. It was a 9-hour session of public testimony. I gave a talk on sea level rise and our statistics, and they passed it. And it came down to the chair of the Planning Commission, who doesn't normally vote, but acts as a tiebreaker. He broke the tie, and it passed. The Corp Counsel for the County of Maui during that 9-hour hearing, final hearing, came out and read a 15-minute statement on why this would not be a takings. And it was a beautiful thing to hear. It was a wonderful piece of legal scholarship. So then it was changed a few more times to broaden the setback. Kauai County came in next with an even more conservative setback, a wider setback with 70 years instead of 50 years. None of these were challenged. None of them have been taken to court. That first one sort of broke the ice, and after that, it's been a wide recognition that we're doing this for their own safety.
Thank
That's
you. I
excellent.
appreciate that description.
So Chip, some of the other things that came out in the interview that you did, let's see, some of the financial tools that you mentioned, do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Sure. So a couple of things have happened. Our CZM program, just like yours, was begun when the national CZM program in 1972 or 74 was created. There are now partnerships set up around the country where states receive a couple $1 million a year from the CZM office in NOAA. This is used to manage the shoreline. In 1974, our coastal zone management law was passed to create our CZM program to receive this NOAA money. And our CZM law just this year in 2020 in a legislature that was held by Zoom finally inserted the word sea level rise into our coastal zone management Hawaii state law. And it identified sea level rise as a coastal hazard. And then it went on to say, any parcel exposed to a coastal hazard must now go through what's called an SMA permit process, which is a heightened permit process that requires public hearings and scrutiny. It used to be that you could renovate your house or build a new house on the coastline simply by visiting a planner and getting your plans stamped, and off you go. And you need your shoreline and calculate a setback. But building the house was, that was not subject to stringent permit requirements. Well, now it is. And they also said that there will be no hardening of the shoreline on beaches that interferes with natural beach processes. All right, what's a beach? So they had to define a beach in the act, in the 2020 revisions to our CZM law. And a beach is now defined as extending seaward under the surf zone, which, as you know, that sand moves on and off of the traditional beach, as well as extending landward under the local community. Any sand deposits, dunes and other types of sand deposits that are landward of the administrative shoreline are considered part of the beach. So you can't build a wall even under the area that is off the beach on the landward direction, and you're no longer under state jurisdiction, which is the seaward side of the upper reach of the wash of the waves. And the landward side is under county jurisdiction. Now you can't even build a seawall back off the beach. So we have what appears to be is finally effectively outlawed seawalls. And we are asking for appropriate levels of scrutiny and hearings if you're going to build adjacent to the shoreline. And now we're left with two problems. One is seawalls that are in existence already that are either non-conforming or permitted. What do we do with those? And number two, all these homes that are in eventually doomed locations. What do we do with all of these parcels that are currently threatened and will grow increasingly vulnerable to sea level rise in all its forms? So in that radio interview, I was just speculating wildly about the fact that we really need to be creative here. And along our shoreline, as you saw in that air photo a few minutes ago, we have very crowded parcels. And these homes range from owner occupied to third homes from CEOs in Singapore. Many of these homes, and I would say some beaches, it's as many as half, maybe more than half these homes are vacation rentals. And most of those are illegal. So one of the economic tools I proposed is, why don't we talk to the owner, say that we're going to shut them down with heavy enforcement unless they agree to the following rule. We'll give them a permit to operate illegally, and we will calculate some period of time when they make some profit. Maybe it'll be a couple $1 million, which is equivalent to the value of the parcel. Maybe a few more million, which is equivalent to the value of the structure and the parcel. Anyway, at some point in the near future, when the vacation rental owner has made some profit, they will then, by agreement, turn over the parcel and the structure to public ownership, to the state or the county. We'll have to figure out who pays for the tear down of the structure. And we also want to then dump sand on it and attempt to rebuild a coastal dune system. Another home might be a corporate home. We have a lot of companies that sell surf gear, and they will rent on the North Shores, especially, homes for their sponsored surfers to live in for the season. We can give them transferable development rights. We can say, look, you have a store further down the road. You are confined to simply 2 stories on that property. We'll give you the development rights for a 3rd story or a larger footprint, or to build a new store in some location that previous rulings, previous land use ordinances didn't allow for a commercial enterprise. And we give them the development rights at some other location, and in exchange, we get either the entire parcel in the home or something. We get some agreement from them, which ultimately rolls them off of that property. Now, what about, the truth is that many of these homes are inherited, and you have families that, let's say you have a family with nobody to leave the home to. Let's give them a reverse mortgage, potentially. If they're on a fixed income and they need more resources, let's give them a reverse mortgage. And in exchange, they leave the property and the house to the state or to the county. Or we set up a mortgage with a local savings and loan that is supported by the state. It's backed up by the state, and this mortgage is available to homeowners on the shoreline at extremely favorable rates. Perhaps there's no down payment required, and they can get a 30-year mortgage for 2% or something, or 2.5%. And that mortgage can then be used by them to buy a new parcel someplace else. And it's contingent on them turning their shoreline property over to the state or the county. Now, because you're still making 2% on this, maybe you split the income from this mortgage scheme. 1% goes to the savings and loan, and the other 1% is used to clear off the lot and potentially bring in sand and start to build a dune system. Basically, the theory here is that every single parcel has its own economic leverage point, and finding out what that would be was the suggestion. And we have, at the University of Hawaii, we have an economic research organization, and I had proposed that, give them $300,000 for a 2-year study to look into the viability of this. Is this just my fantasy land, or is this actually a viable approach? Vincent.
Thank you, Chip. So I have the point you're raising is very interesting. You're looking at the municipality, or effectively the state of Hawaii, undertaking this purchase or these various financial lever points. But what I didn't hear is how this might be achieved in a different way, federally. Say the way that the FEMA flood zones, there's buyouts of some of those properties. Could that be a potential instead? And then that would remove the financial burden from the municipality or the state of Hawaii.
Yeah, absolutely. So the problem is we don't have hurricanes. Now, you wouldn't think of that as a problem, but that's typically what triggers the National Flood Insurance Program. And I know Superstorm Sandy didn't qualify as a hurricane, but nonetheless, I don't know the details, but I know New Jersey and New York was able to get a lot of buyouts out of after Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy. But really what we have is large waves. And if you look at, this poor guy right here, he is inches from destruction, right? And unfortunately, what you see, all this junk on the shoreline, this is the state handing, instead of handing out seawall permits, the state hands out geotextile cloth and allows them to use this. And by the way, all these homes are sitting on beautiful sand deposits that if they were released, you could have nice wide beaches. So the other thing that I am recommending is that a thorough analysis of the federal buyout funding. There are conservation easements available through the Department of Agriculture. There are various types of federal programs that could lead to buyouts. They're confusing. I don't fully understand them. They need to be studied with the idea of, what can we get from a linear application, and then where can we bend them a little bit to get some advantages.
Interesting. Quite literally yesterday, we learned more about the Nantucket erosion hazard map. We found out yesterday this is something that's going to be undertaken throughout FEMA Region 1, and then it's going to be continued nationally as well. So the understanding I got from part of yesterday's launch of the FEMA Region 1 erosion hazard mapping for Nantucket is that once they take this far enough, there's going to be a suggestion that this might be turned into something similar to firms, that it would become an erosion map, so that if you were in a particular zone, you couldn't do a particular development. But if you're already in that zone, there's the potential it might be a buyout situation.
That would be fantastic. That would be enormous. And I wish the Senate were trending another direction today. If we got both houses and the executive branch, I could see that happening, but that's what it's going to take, is both houses and the executive branch, I think. Sarah?
Yeah, so I mean, this is more of a comment just to kind of piggyback on what y'all are saying, was that with a lot of these buyout programs and, anything that's like a new idea like that is going to take a long time, right? It's going to take a lot of support at multiple levels, and whether it's Nantucket does it as its own municipality, whatever it might be, or even of course at the federal level, it's going to take so much time and effort and support. But locally, we have a sort of town-based organization, the Nantucket Land Bank, that's doing this at a parcel by parcel level. So in some of the vulnerable areas that are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise and adjacent to land bank property already, they have the money to, buy individuals' houses, parcels, and move the homes, and then create them as like parks and basically open green space. It would be nice if there was more, consistent plantings to help, work with sea level rise, but I think that's the direction they're going. But that is, once again, that's one organization doing it at a parcel by parcel level. So it's really interesting to I feel like that's the kind of thing that can happen at a small level as a sort of Band-Aid, if you will, for now, while these kind of bigger picture things potentially happen. I think, I'm looking at Holly right now thinking, this works well for the areas where there's newer construction, where there's, I say newer construction, newer homes, things like that. But, we are a historic island, and there are so many historic homes and historic structures that there's been a lot of work done to think of how to kind of live with the water. And so I can't imagine that next step of, okay, in the, maybe in the erosion zone was one thing, because if the land erodes, obviously the structures are gone. But in the sea level rise component, I don't know what we do with our historic structures. I honestly, it's just an interesting thought, and I don't know from the Hawaiian Islands perspective, how have you guys dealt with that before?
We have historic structures, but they are not a major barrier to, in this case. Our area that is of greatest concern is downtown Honolulu. It's built on an old wetland. In fact, it used to be a former salt gathering location prior to Western contact for Native Hawaiians. And this area right here, and Waikiki is also an old wetland. The only reason they are still dry today is because we dredged reefs, we dredged this canal, and we put all the dredge spoils, we dredged Honolulu Harbor, we put the dredge spoils here, and we raised the land 2 feet. And this area in particular is currently the site of major development where there are towers going up, 400-foot towers. And this is encouraged because we have a housing shortage. And these towers are a mixture of, high-end luxury condos plus a required percentage of affordable condos. And the city of Honolulu, which is the entity responsible for permitting the construction of these towers, just yesterday held an online workshop through the local branch of the architects, AIA, I forget what that is, but an architects, National Architects Organization. And they're beginning to push out guidelines and examples from other cities of how, like you said, you live with water. Now, we're not doing it in terms of 300 or 400-year-old wood frame structures. We're doing it in terms of how do you build a 40-story condominium tower that will eventually have water running around it, but we still want to engage in placemaking. We want to have neighborhoods where people can come outside and gather. We want to have transportation still available. So we're talking about basically flyover roads. That is, you don't raise a road like Miami is doing and build a dike out of it. Far more expensive. You have a road which is basically a low bridge, and water, the tides can flow in and out underneath the road. This means we're going to greatly limit the number of roads so that there are only a couple of main roads. And that we also, the base of these towers is not just cement podiums, but that they are structured as plazas with steps that go up to 6 feet. And then there's a open air plaza as part of the ground floor, and then the tower is above that. So very different than what you're talking about, but sort of, another end member in terms of learning to live with water. They are deciding that this area is just too heavily developed. We can't retreat. We don't know where all that development would go and who would pay for the enormous cost of removing it. So that's what we're imagining the future to be.
Peter, yes?
Yeah, Peter.
So Chip, that is our, it's a sort of a mirror image of our issue for our downtown area, but on a smaller scale. If you're on our waterfront, say you're out in a boat and you're looking at our town, you're looking at a coastal bank that, for those of us, we know where that is on the island, basically from Cumberland Farms going all the way up and over the town and out along the North Shore. And I guess the coastal bank goes all the way to Eel Point, but pretty much in downtown area from that coastal bank east is land that was tidelands that we filled in. And that's part of our charge, is to decide how are we going to make it so that land is going to be livable. How much are we going to, what are we going to do to preserve the history of these buildings? Are we going to be raising our roads, or how much are we going to give up? I completely understand what you're saying, because we're facing that. We're already, I don't know how much you've read about us, but we're already facing that. As whenever we get a storm, a nor'easter is our winter hurricane. And when we get one of those and we get storm surge of maybe just 4 or 5 feet, certain streets along the waterfront flood every single time, even in times when it's just a little bit of a blow. So
yeah. So I want you to see this. This came out maybe 3 weeks ago. This is a paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The natural buffer system preventing Pine Island and Thwaites glaciers from flowing rapidly is breaking down. The ice shelves are showing new damage that are the first signs of structural weakening and precondition these ice shelves for disintegration. And they're talking about new fractures that are forming up here along the margins of the Pine Island and Thwaites glaciers. Well, this is, you know, something that we had a hope not to see until the second half of the century. And Pine Island and Thwaites Glacier alone have 4 feet of sea level rise in them. And so this plus all those economic signals I gave you tell me that we need to plan for multi-meter sea level rise. And I know that you guys are using the NOAA high scenario.
Just to give you perspective, that in our location calls for about 9 feet by 2100 above the level in 2000. So yes, it's pretty significant here.
Yep, that's great. You could probably keep on with that, but whatever your reasoning was for picking 9 feet, please now build into that it looks like the West Antarctic glaciers are outside the IPCC modeling. Those models cannot account for this, and that we're looking at far worse sea level rise than had been expected. So, Peter, in response to your question about, you know, what do you do in these downtown areas? Number one, the decision has to be made: do we stay or do we leave? And that decision, I think, for the public, needs to be based on, well, what would it look like if we stay? What would it look like? And that's what Miami-Dade County planning departments are doing. They are engaged in lots of public hearings. And as you heard, we do a lot of public hearings here in Hawaii, and that's our professional county or state planning organizations. I believe you guys are a citizens advisory group rather than a planning agency.
We're advisory to the local government body. The select board is similar to a city council, but we don't have a mayor.
You have a planning department.
Yes.
And are they involved in sea level rise?
We have a representative from the planning board in our committee. Unfortunately, he's not here today. But yes, so our committee draws from planning, draws from our harbor management, draws from our conservation organizations, concerned citizens, our natural resources department in the town. Vince, am I leaving anybody out?
Voting taxpayers.
Yes, yeah, that's like you. We have a lot of people who own a property here but do not live here year round, and they are also represented.
Do you have any authority?
No, we're an advisory committee, but we have had success in, we're a year old, in making a recommendation to the select board, which they adopted as a policy statement. So we do have some ability to do that. The select board created us for that purpose, to give them advice on policies that could be created, and then also to work with the outside consultants who are developing our coastal resilience plan.
So yeah, let you guys make a comment. I have some thoughts, but why don't some other people take a shot at talking?
Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on with the policy we talked about really briefly, but and that we went with the NOAA high because we didn't want to specify the 9 foot, say it, because we knew it would change. And to your point, Chip, earlier you said you had to say, we're going to do this footage. I can't remember what you said, but then recognize we're going to be coming back to tell you it's changed. And so what we did was to make the policy use the NOAA high and use the most recent up to date, and here's where you find it. And that was a goal. That was in an effort to put the, we get this passed, and if the select board changes, if other things change, at least we have this in place, and that will hopefully kind of update as the NOAA high predictions change. The other thing was to your point too of using the most localized data and you being kind of in the line of fire because of that. I mean, for us, it was a little easier to say, this is what NOAA says, and we trust them, and this is the best science we have available now. There's lots of different science and conservation organizations on the island, and I think that if any one even entity or even said something different, it would be more difficult for a lot of the sort of naysayers or people who might be economically impacted by that policy statement. So it's a sort of easier for us to say using the NOAA standards. They're over there, like in the kind of bigger cloud. So I'm interested to hear your opinion on that, because now we also have the erosion, the FEMA erosion map, which we just got yesterday. And so that kind of brings another layer into it as well.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly smart, number one, that you went with the high. And number two, that you're relying on sort of governmental sources of data, federal sources of data. When we started our modeling, that's the role that we took for the state and counties in Hawaii. The federal sources were not up to truly characterizing the threat, and they still aren't. But I think what you did was exactly the right thing. And you've also hired a consultant who hopefully, your questions about what do we do, with the urban area, the commercial area, I imagine, I'm not saying anything different than they are, you can learn to live with water, or you can move away from it. And what would that entail? But actually, so Miami has citizens advisory committees. Hawaii and the counties have citizens advisory committees. We have you, but it's the planning departments that are going out and holding public hearings and taking, the arrows from the public. And it's not fair for you guys who are volunteering to go out there and to endure the wrath of homeowners who don't understand what sea level rise really means. So one thing I would message here is that your planning department needs to get deeply involved with this. And I don't know all the details in politics, but that's just an idea I would plant.
I think we're moving in that direction. Holly, I was going to come to you. We're due for an update of our master plan, and we have been told that sea level rise and coastal resilience will be part of that process. Holly is here. She works for the planning department, and she has a project going on right now. Holly, if you want to speak briefly about that, or if you had a different question.
Sure. Hi. Yes, yeah. I'm the preservation planner for the town, as well as the local hazard mitigation plan coordinator. So I've got the benefit of both worlds, so to speak, and that's basically been really important since we are a National Historic Landmark District. But as far as Nantucket's planning goes, we're very unique. Not only are we an island, a county, a town, but we're also our own regional planning authority, which is very helpful. So I work for the Planning and Land Use Services Department, but which is also part of the Regional Planning Authority. So it's kind of a double dip, if you will. And as Mary mentioned, one of the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee's members is actually part of both the Planning Board and the Planning Commission, which is very, very beneficial in that regards. And really, Massachusetts has been instrumental in being, I would say, a forefront when it comes to coastal states with creating what they call the Massachusetts Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And we went through a 8-hour planning process with the community, with many different interests at large, from not only our preservation folks, but also public interest, private interests. We had select board members involved. We had our conservation folks included, and came out with a set of priorities. And quite frankly, that's where we're at as far as being able to have a coastal resiliency coordinator, who's Vince, and being able to have a coastal resiliency advisory committee and really set out a list of priorities. And I think that the Commonwealth has been very, very proactive in this approach. One of our other priorities was to create historic design guidelines for our FEMA flood areas, because we are a National Historic Landmark. Obviously, that's part of our identity. We've been established since the 1600s. You know, we want to make sure that that part is, Nantucketers have always had to be resilient, but how do we bridge this with our preservation folks in our historic built environment? And through this MVP program that the Commonwealth has, we were able to apply for an action grant to create these design guidelines, hence the Resilient Nantucket, which is bringing in not only experts within sea level rise, coastal flooding, but also how do we adapt these structures that have been around for 300 years? How do we adapt our new infill construction, as well as our streetscapes, and making sure that we're not hindering our National Historic Landmark status? And it's amazing to see, even from the federal government's perspective, from the National Park Service, they finally came up with design guidelines that are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is what the basis of preservation is all about. They finally came up with those design guidelines back in November of last year, and they're supposed to be giving redoing them, including illustrations. So I'm looking for every day. I'm looking to see if something's been posted on that. But anyway, there's been a lot of different things for us. And you brought up a good point, and I'm very appreciative of you being able to assist Nantucket and give us your experience. Hawaii in general, being an island, and you were talking about the dredging component down in your historic area. And I'm curious, we've talked about dredging here for quite a bit. I know Vince could probably talk a little bit more about it, but you know, I'm wondering how much of your having stormwater and your, you know, those systems being efficient, as well as including green infrastructure, because I think that's also plays a part with this flooding that we see on a day-to-day basis, what they call obviously sunny day flooding, not just associated with a storm that passes by. I really do think that we could look to communities that have actually tackled both dredging and have efficient stormwater components. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all that. You're hitting really what is a huge problem for us. And we have been modeling, my group has been modeling flooding. So this is a map showing in blue bathtub flooding, in green storm drains that backflow onto the street at high tide, right? Salt water coming out of storm drains. And in purple, the groundwater table, which rises with the ocean. If you monitor your groundwater table, do you know this already about groundwater inundation? Okay. So the water table is really our major threat. And there's 1 foot of sea level rise, and we're starting to see groundwater flooding occurring. There's 2 feet of sea level rise, and we map everything at mean high or high water. So now we're starting to see some green, and the red lines are individual blocks where the roads have more than 6 inches of standing water. And that's an engineering standard for a small vehicle. Will create a back wave in front of them if they drive through it, and it'll stall the vehicle. And so if you have a 2-lane road with standing water and a stalled vehicle, that road's considered no longer viable as a transportation source. And then you see these individual pink dots. Those are individual storm drains that are backflowing onto the road at 2 feet of sea level rise. Now, between 2 and 3 feet of sea level rise, we see what I call a sort of a socioeconomic tipping point. We see a dramatic increase in flooding. There's 3 feet. So between 2 feet and 3 feet, now the blue is coming in. That's still water flooding coming over the shoreline. This is a drainage issue. And it's just what you were saying. When it rains and it's high tide, we get this situation. And our highest tides are in the summer, are late in the day, which is why you see these headlights. This is everybody in downtown Honolulu, Waikiki, trying to get home to their families. And this situation broke up thousands of families until 1 and 2 a.m. in the morning. Unable to pick up kids from school, get home to attend to ill and ill grandparents, etc. Went on and on. So this is compound flooding, and we do not have a solution, Holly. We don't have a solution yet, but recognizing the problem, first of all, and what Miami is doing, you may know, is raising roads. I think they're putting timed gates on some of their storm drains, or they have backflow. I think they put in like a wedge, flow preventers, which slow down tidal flow coming up the storm drain enough so that it doesn't flood out the storm drain. It holds it back long enough that when low tide comes, then it drains back out. It's not a complete blockage, it's sort of a wedge, but it does allow rainfall to drain out. So it partially closes off the storm drains in the direction of high tide flooding up. But this is really the big problem, other than a hurricane storm surge.
Yeah, and we see that here as
I don't know
well.
what the HTC regulations are, to be honest with you. We only deal with Concom.
We've got some background noise. Is that Vince? Is that you?
Yeah.
Or? Okay.
Yeah, I was hoping
Yeah.
to just ask a question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vince.
So we have very similar issues here, and not to take away from the conversation Gary Beller could easily bring up, but we have extremely low-lying areas, just like Miami, just like some of the areas of downtown Honolulu you're describing. And it's not a drainage issue sometimes, as is a low-lying area issue. Sea levels are coming up to meet the height of the existing land, and that is a major problem. And it's in an area on the kind of just north of the downtown area here that has some of the highest land values and highest house prices on island, and in some cases in the state. They're extremely expensive. And they're at an elevation starting in some areas at 2 feet, and I think they go up to about 5 feet, all in this one extremely low-lying area. So it's not like they have a lot of time left. So the question becomes, what other adaptation methods can we do? And if we were to put a wall all around that area and try and keep the water out, we'd have to look at some kind of compensatory area to put the water instead. We can't just keep water out of one area and then just expect it to stay in the sea. We have to have an equal area for it to be displaced in another part of the harbour or very nearby. And we don't have that because of our extremely expensive waterfront.
Yeah, I hear you. One of the things about groundwater inundation is that a wall won't protect you. And storm drain backflow, a wall won't protect you. And even a wall eventually won't protect you. So you might just consider, I don't know, be sure that you factor in more complex thinking than just a wall as a solution, because ultimately,
yeah,
maybe it's a good step.
It was a poor example because walls are effectively illegal. Seawalls are effectively illegal in Massachusetts anyway, unless it's replacing an existing seawall, or the seawall is to protect a historic structure that's pre-78. Holly can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's basically the way it is for pretty much any coastal engineering structure, not just walls. So like if you wanted to do a revetment or some kind of other type of coastal bank, it has to be for a specific reason, and we're dwindling reasons at this point. So it was just an example of how difficult it is. We also have some experience with backflow preventer valves, duck bills, as they get called here, where they water pressure on the outside seals them shut, and then once the tide goes down, they open up and can let water out. But we've had issues with them as well. they suffer from excessive flow and then get damaged, or they suffer from excessive temperature because they're black and get too warm and then deform. So we're in some cases looking at maybe going back to flapper gates instead of duckbills. So we're constantly looking at new methods and new upgrades.
And
So
Chip, that might be a good point after you respond to Vince. You had mentioned a couple of ideas for removing existing coastal structures. And so if you have the ability to get to that after you respond to Vince, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't have much of a response, Vince. I hear you. We have duckbills also. They eventually became not effective. We haven't tried any flapper valves yet, and backflow preventers, our folks are aware of those. We actually put together a team of 13 department heads, 2 university folks, myself included, and department heads from the county and the state, County of Honolulu and the state. And we did a 1-week learning trip. We did this on a grant. We traveled to Miami. We visited with Miami-Dade County officials. We visited with Miami Beach officials. We then went to Charleston and spent 2 days with folks in Charleston, South Carolina. Then we were going to stop in Norfolk, which I wish we had, and it was a mistake not to, Virginia, and then we went to Boston and spent 2 days up in Boston. So we set up these seminars and field trips with all the folks wrestling with sea level rise in those locations. That was a great experience, and we now have agencies led by people who totally get it. They have anxiety over this problem, which is what you want people to have. Yeah, so removing existing walls. They currently, when you have, if you're a parcel owner on a beach and you have an existing wall, which is either non-conforming or permitted, and you want to renovate your house, you need to go to the state and get an easement for your wall, because just about everywhere, the upper reach of the wash of the waves is now hitting the base of your wall. And the assumption has been made legally that your wall is now on state land, because I didn't mention this. The upper reach of the wash of the waves defines what is state land, conservation land, seaward, and what is county or federal or state land or something landward. But landward of the upper reach of the wash of the waves can be developed. And the state typically has given 50-year easements for these walls. They've now brought it down to 25-year easements. I'm making a lot of noise. Let's make these 5-year easements. And let's increase the cost of the walls, because, to reflect their societal impact. These walls wipe out beaches. An 8th grader can understand that if you are a beach and the ocean is rising, you have one option defined as the edge of an ocean ecosystem. You have to move landward, and a wall prevents that. So because of beach loss and because of very strong public trust laws, and I know you have them too, and public access, the beach is considered public trust land, and when it disappears in front of a wall, there is a public impact, and the easements should reflect that public impact the same way that the taxes on cigarettes reflect the public impact, and other types of, reflecting the real impact of an action. So I'm encouraging them to do this, and we'll see if they ever get to that point. And eventually, the idea here is just making it too expensive for people to continue to pay this easement at high cost, and watching other properties erode away, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, one more thing, I'll make this quick. Also, the delivery of public services. picking up the garbage, fresh water, sewage, electricity. These public services grow actually more and more hazardous for the government agency to repair them, to act on them as areas become more and more vulnerable to flooding. So the cost of public services to these parcels should reflect the real cost and the potential danger. Overall, this is a set of tools, and there are many more you can think of, just simply making it too expensive to stay in that footprint. And that'll only apply to a couple of parcels, right? I mean, if you're a billionaire, who cares how expensive it is? We have them, and I know you do too.
Did you have, I think you had some thoughts on other financial strategies to assist people in transitioning away from the coast?
I think I went through everything, unless there's something you're remembering that I didn't cover.
I know that one thing that I saw recently was an idea that while FEMA currently offers flood insurance that allows you to rebuild on site, they don't allow you to move off site and use those insurance proceeds to rebuild. So that seems like one easy fix that could be made. But then they were further saying that what if FEMA offered not only insurance against hazard, but sort of a payment plan on a future relocation. So you could pay FEMA, a few $1,000s a year. And at some point in the future, when your property was threatened, but before it was actually damaged, you could call on that policy to help you move to another property or to make up some of the difference between the value of your property threatened and useful.
You could do that with a private insurer.
You could? Okay.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if FEMA will do that sort of boutique arrangement, but I know private insurers will. And it's becoming more and more difficult to get any of the national carriers to insure a coastal parcel. But they will all be happy to insure you if they do a site inspection and they charge you, if you're willing to pay the real cost, the real risk that they would carry. And this is a great idea, Mary. Pay them more to sort of as a way to make bank on buying a parcel a little further down the line, if you have the capacity to do that.
Let's see.
So this image is in Tanner Springs Park in Portland, Oregon. Instead of a grassy field as a public park, they've excavated it. And it's now a wetland. They've hit the water table. Used to be a stream fed by a spring. It's a wetland. It's full of water birds, and it's a storm retention basin. And the excavation, the fill, can be used to raise the surrounding shoreline. And large buildings don't need fill. They simply build a cement podium, or they build the first couple of floors to be sort of open air and meant to be flooded. But you can raise surrounding areas. So this is exactly what our Kaka'ako area looks like, right next to Waikiki, where I said all these towers were going up. And they're that's the same area. You can see how deep it is. It's significantly deep. This is in Rotterdam. Again, excavation basin is a flood retention location. If you have a basin like this, let's say this is some of your historic sites, potentially re-drain these areas, maybe raise them, put fill under the road, raise the whole thing, and then have your drainage flow into a local excavation basin if there is empty land nearby. This is Seoul, Korea. This used to be a highway running under a bridge, but they've sort of let loose the river and the groundwater that was there originally, and they've made a long linear park out of it. And this is an excavated basin, which is a park, and I guess this is St. Louis, although I haven't yet convinced myself that that's actually the arch. But anyway, it's the idea is, you know, create public amenities that are also storm water retention basins, and then replumb your public storm drain system to use this. It's a way to manage the water.
So we're at 5 minutes to 3. I want to just go around to the members of the committee. Did you have any questions or comments for Chip while we have him here? I'm not worried about ending on the dot, but I do want to make sure everybody has a chance. Peter?
So Chip, you spoke a lot about your planning board doing outreach into the community. And we here, I'm sure it's the same there. And you mentioned the billionaires, you know, as long as it doesn't affect them right now while they're enjoying their millions, why should they care? But it's likewise for people who don't necessarily live down by the water, they live up a ways from. Public education is a huge thing. How are we going to get people to buy into the big emergency that we see coming? That some people are, or a lot of people are just saying, oh, that's a ways off. And I've been here on Nantucket for a while, and I know that Nantucket puts out fires and then moves on to the next fire. And this is a big fire that's not going away. It's, in fact, it's accelerating, getting taller and coming closer to us. And I sense a lot of apathy in our community, not the people on this call and not the people in town government, but the general population. It's not on their radar. How do we put it on their radar? You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's the first and has to be the ongoing thread. It's extremely important. Raising awareness and everybody onto the same playing field is extremely important. And there, you know, you need to engage in many, many tools, from school curricula to official public hearings by government agencies, just information hearings, maybe not connected with any proposed project at all, but just information sharing. Our Department of Planning and Permitting did sea level rise pop-ups. They would announce them online beforehand. This was during COVID. They put together 4 or 5 posters, and 2 or 3 planners from our Department of Planning and Permitting would go for 3 or 4 hours to a location in Waikiki, Kaka'ako, Honolulu, different communities, and they would just set up their posters, put out some beach chairs, and have public discussions with people as they came by, wondering, hey, what are those posters? And I write a number of articles, you know, opinion pieces to go in the local newspaper, both digital. We have a digital newspaper called Civil Beat, and I wrote a piece 2 days ago about withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. And I regularly write pieces for our bricks and mortar newspaper. It's helped a lot to have a university person work hand in hand with the local planners. If you have someone, I know the USGS folks over there on Cape Cod, some university folks, Woods Hole, or the USGS office, if you can get somebody over there to become a trusted messenger and to come over once a month and help you with public hearings and things like that. I mean, it just has to come from all directions at all times without let up, and must absolutely reflect the peer-reviewed science. It must reflect the peer-reviewed literature, because when you get questions, you need to be able to point to scientific studies and say, you know, I'm not making this stuff up. But you're right, Peter. I mean, that's critically important. One more thing I wanted to say very briefly. What some of our departments have decided to do is to they're coming together. You know, government agencies are very stovepiped and they're not used to working together, but a road carries sewage lines, freshwater lines, storm drain lines, electrical lines. Around a road, you have lots of government agencies. And if you move or raise a road, those agencies have to work together. So we're creating resilience teams where representatives of the relevant agencies for transportation, for roadways, come together once a month. And what they're working on now is picking a demonstration project. Like, we're ready to spend a few $1 million, and they're identifying a location where, to demonstrate what it would look like, and if it fails, there's minimal loss. If it works, you have a demonstration of something then that could be adapted and molded to work elsewhere.
Thank you. Graham, did you want to ask any questions?
No, just maybe a comment. Thank you. A lot of food for thought. One thing that, a couple things that you spoke about brought to mind. I wonder if there's something we could do. DPW is coming to mind in terms of capturing or understanding the costs associated with maintaining roads that are impacted by flooding or erosion, and understanding the true costs of, of maintaining homes and buildings in those areas. And that could be something we ask DPW to track going forward. And I'm sure that that could be applied to other departments as well. But I know that's something DPW tracks for other things. So something to consider, just what are the costs of maintaining these things? Thanks.
Yep. Gary?
Well, the only comment I have is when you were talking about backflow problems, that's really what caused a lot of the problems at Brand Point when they were improperly put in the Children's Beach pump. They didn't have any backflow control. And so when the big storms hit and with rising tides, guess what? The storm drains emptied, but they couldn't go anywhere because the tide was stronger and flooded the streets. And it took about 2 or 3 years of citizens screaming before the town hired a professional engineer to figure out that they had installed the pumps improperly, and they finally put a backflow in. So it's improved a lot, but it's probably going to happen again in the future unless we get more sensitive and get the island dealing with these issues. I'm surprised that we haven't seen any impact yet from bank lending, and maybe it's because we have a wealthy type population, as Hawaii probably does, so people aren't running to the banks to buy these condos on the water because they can afford them. At some point, whether the insurance gets too high for people or the banks stop lending money, that's when the public will start feeling it. But right now, I don't think that's having an impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
We're just hearing in the last couple of weeks, actually, the first sort of articles written on the Miami real estate market, and that in some places it's starting to reflect the hazard there. But you're right, it's the market is really out of equilibrium.
Matt, did you have questions or comments?
And just one, it's reflected here already. We've got areas where house values are dropping, and they're not, they've got beautiful views. People are sort of figuring it out. My question, you're talking about lot lines. How do they handle, from a planning perspective, things like, sort of swimming pools and decks? Are they considered ground cover? Are they considered an issue for this whole thing, or?
They're not considered anything different than, well, there is language about habitable structures. So, but you may not build in the setback anything. You can't even do a gazebo for your daughter's wedding. It's just an analogy I like to make. So it is controlled the same way as any other significant dwelling. So we have a number of communities and tens of thousands of people who live on the other side of the island from Honolulu, and they are supported by this one road. And the Department of Transportation, the road is being actively undermined and overwashed. And the department, this is even 2 feet of sea level rise. The Department of Transportation just spent $10 million putting in basically fancy sandbags, but they've stated publicly they don't want to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars to raise or move this road if the communities that it serves are ultimately doomed. So that's an interesting dilemma. It's Band-Aids on purpose because they don't know that these roads are going to be here in the future because the communities may not be here in the future.
We're starting to have that conversation here as well. We have sort of a hub and spoke road system where to get from one part of the island to another part of the island, you have to come into town and then go out a different road. And so many of those areas are served by one main road. And many of them are low-lying, and that could be a problem.
Yeah.
It's going to be a problem.
Massachusetts state law is difficult in that area. If a road is if its road is a public road and there's an issue, we are responsible to provide access to people on that public road. And so it hasn't caught up with what's going to happen with sea level rise. So, that's one of the deals. That's one of the things as a select board member that we struggle with. We've had to build roads and get, land back from the Conservation Foundation or the land bank to run a road to service 4 houses because that was required under state law.
We are very lucky in the sense that our state legislature is, just a mile away. We can go in and lobby like crazy. I imagine where is it, Springfield or something? It's a major trip to get up to your state legislature. And our county is literally the next parcel over from the state capitol. So it's easy for us to have an active hand in lawmaking.
Sarah, did you want to add anything?
No, I just wanted to thank you, Chip, for all the information. I think it's, as Graham said, it's a lot of food for thought, and I appreciate too the online resources that we can kind of mine, especially now that we're starting to work with the consultant. I think, and we're just gathering more and more information. I think we have a lot to work with. So especially, I think for the outreach components and some of the educational materials, that we want to start circulating, as you say, kind of hitting people from all sides. I'm going to definitely be looking at some of those resources too for ideas for our community. So thank you so much.
And Holly, I'll give you an opportunity as well, if you have any questions or comments.
No, I just wanted to thank you very, very much. I think it gives us a really good understanding, from an island to island perspective. I think that's really important. And if we can learn from other communities that have gone farther than we have gone, I greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Holly.
And Vince. Anything you want? Yeah.
Yeah, very, very briefly. Thank you very, very much, Chip. Brilliant talk today and sincerely appreciated. I did have one or two interesting observations from the sea level rise information you were giving at the start. And very, very quickly and briefly, Nantucket is roughly running, as most of the northeast of the US is running, about double the global sea level rise estimates. Once you started talking about how that was likely inadequate and that the global was going to be multi-meter, I'm wondering if we should start to revise our estimates yet again because of ice shelves that are now melting that weren't expected to give way for quite some decades. That has me extra worried, and maybe you and I can discuss that at another point in the future. But thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, Hawaii and the whole tropical Pacific would be experiencing sea level fall right now, because I don't know if you've heard of the glacial floor bulge, but it's basically New York City and south. That land was raised during the weight of the ice age, the glacier, and now it's collapsing back down. And that's one reason why you have accelerated rates of sea level rise, is your land is going down, maybe not Nantucket, but south of you, as well as global sea level is going up. And as the continental shelf and the ocean basin deepens offshore the East Coast, water has to flow in from someplace to fill it in, and it's flowing from the Pacific. So we had sea level fall. And just 2,000 years ago, sea level was perhaps 2 meters higher around here. But anthropogenic sea level rise has overwhelmed that global pattern of sea level fall, and now we have sea level rise. For the geologists among you, which I know Mary is.
All right, that wraps up our session. Let me add my thanks, Dr. Fletcher, to that of the committee. We really do appreciate taking time out of the day, especially with the time difference. I'm so glad we could work this out. Yeah. And if there are things that we learn that we think would be helpful, I'm sure we'd be happy to send them to you.
Please.
But that island solidarity, we are small, but we are mighty. Yeah.
Thank you. I've had a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody.
Right. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Sorry, we need a motion to adjourn before we all go off.
Can I make a motion to adjourn?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Pat. All right, so I'll do a roll call vote. Gary Beller.
Aye.
Sarah Boyce.
Aye.
Peter Brace.
Aye.
Graham Durovich.
Aye.
Matt Fee.
Aye.
And Mary Longacre, aye. Thank you once again.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Fletcher, if you could send that PowerPoint to us, we would appreciate that very much.
Okay, will do.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you, Vince.